to say thank you very much to Rector Vasilia for agreeing to host this meeting, and to Stephen for working with us in making sure that we actually all got here today and can talk to you about what we're doing. I think I need somebody to... Could somebody just come? I can't read Russian, I'm very sorry. Yes. Yes, please. I just want it to be on the full screen.
Oh no, this is
It's okay.
yes, it's
Okay, right. It's just I have a problem, you don't have a problem, so it's fine. So as Stephen said in his introduction, EUA carries out as part of its work a number of studies, and the elephants, the publications that you see on the screen there, are our two publications on ranking, and I will say a little bit more about that in a minute. I think I could tell you the story of the elephant. I'd be very curious if anyone knows the fable, the poem about the elephant and the blind men. Maybe come back to that later. No, it's not. Does it go down? Sorry. No, it's gone back. Very sorry about this. Anyway, Stephen's already told you about the European University Association, that is a membership body, and he's already, I think, informed you about a number of different activities that the EUA undertakes. I think the important thing about the European University Association is we are a very diverse organisation. So we have 800 members, we have 33 national associations, and when in the early part of or about 10 years ago, the question of rankings came up, and there was the publication of the Shanghai rankings, we had an enormous discussion inside our organisation about the importance of rankings, whether they were a good thing or whether they were a bad thing. And we decided in the end that this is something that we had to investigate further as an association, and that it was certainly part of a greater number of international developments and changes that are taking place in higher education around the world. We all know about IT developments and globalization and the demands that this makes on societies around the world and on universities, and the growing focus on excellence in this increasingly competitive environment. And I think the phenomenon of rankings, which have always existed more or less, at least over the last 100 years or so in the United States, which has always been a very competitive system, that the phenomenon of rankings as students began to move more around the world, as recruitment of students increased, as systems became more and more interconnected. I think it was in this context that rankings developed, even if we all know that the Shanghai ranking was indeed developed simply for the purposes of Chinese universities to try and evaluate how they are faring in their internally, but also in terms of comparison with other universities in the world. So that's how we got there. And we decided 10 years ago that what could we do for universities at the time? There was an awful lot of discussion about the various rankings developing. And what we decided, and we have some copies of the reports here, we decided that as a university organisation, what we ought to do is actually analyse the phenomenon, not to try and judge the rankings at that time, but to actually analyse the various facets and elements and criteria used by the various rankings in order to find out what they measured, because there was much discussion and very little knowledge at this time, to find out how the scores for the various indicators are calculated, and to discuss what the results actually mean. So for that we have two quite large publications that you can have a look at if you're interested, and they're also on our website. In the meantime, we're starting to look at the impact of rankings on national systems, internationally, and on strategic policies in universities. And that is another project called RISP here on the slide that it will be finished and completed very soon. Just to say, that's how we've approached the question. And the rankings that we looked at are all these very well-known rankings that I'm sure you've all heard of, but that are all very, very different. I think these are the major rankings. They were all somehow have developed over the last 10 years. They regularly change their methodology, so it's a constant struggle to understand exactly what is being measured. And you'll hear more in particular from Mikael afterwards on the U multi-rank. I just use this slide, which is somewhere in one of the publications, to say that even nowadays, rankings only affect the global rankings. I'm not talking about your national rankings, or there are many national rankings. In fact, the rankings are only relevant for the global rankings for 3 to 5% of the world's universities. So when we talk about global rankings, it's actually a very small number of universities that are concerned. Of course, it's an important issue for you and for many Russian universities. The same for our members, which are all research universities. But in many parts of the world, this is the global rankings are not of major importance, because the universities still are developing and at the same time beginning to consider also their national performance in the national context. Same thing here. Basically what happens if we look at the various criteria used for the Shanghai rankings, for the Taiwan rankings, and for others, for the Times Higher and QS. In fact, the scores that you get when you count essentially the publications, they decrease very quickly, and so that's how we can see that after the number 400 or 500 they don't really appear anymore, and hence we have to remember that these rankings, other than the U multi-rank, which is a very different type of ranking that Mikael will explain, they're focused mainly on research and research publications, and the big challenge is really how do we consider teaching and the importance and value of teaching, and how can we best assess the quality of teaching at a time when the number of students around the world is growing very rapidly. So that's kind of the introduction, and I think very soon we saw that policymakers and individual universities around the world began to take rankings very seriously, while not often understanding precisely the extent to which the indicators are valid. At the same time, we see, in parallel to the discussion on rankings, the discussion that you have here in Russia and in many other countries about what is a world-class university, and somehow in this context, at least the discussion on the top 100 has become some kind of measure of global competitiveness. Whether we like it or not, this is the reality, and as I say, we had huge discussions inside of our association about that. Again, whether the indicators are flawed or not is perhaps no longer the main issue. They are nevertheless setting the parameters for one definition, at any rate, of quality. And more important, when we look around the world, I have to say, is that rankings, pushed also by the policies of some of the global organizations, such as the World Bank, have driven major change and transformation, and also experimentation at system level and in higher educations around the world. At the same time, perhaps we should also say, and you've been having this discussion also in Russia, where do you invest, where do you put your money in a difficult climate? And I think it is true to say that over the last 10 years, less for higher education, but the question of research funding linked to the question of rankings and global competitiveness has actually moved very high up on the agenda thanks to the rankings. Stop, there we go. And I think this is something we don't just see in one country or in one continent. And I think it's worthwhile bearing in mind that how the world's economy has changed and different shifts that have taken place in the last 10 years that are also in parallel with the rankings, and perhaps explain why there are many parts of the world that's interest in ranking. At the beginning, in 2003, we were still all, at least among the OECD countries, in a period of development. Whereas, as at least we in Europe know very well, now we are in a major crisis and still in a major crisis. And so there have been all these shifts and changes around the world, and it's led to greater competition. Everybody's looking for the most talented people in their universities, and in a way, hence this has given greater importance to how we define performance at a system and a national level, and hence the rankings also in this changed economic context are perhaps less about student mobility and individual choice, but more about geopolitical standing and positioning in a way, so they've taken on a very important position. So what have we learned? I think, as I've said, decision-making in many different countries and inside institutions is being influenced. This is what we see also from our analysis, not just developing the methodologies, but the process and the project looking at impact on institutions. We see it in our discussions inside the European Union. Nearly every country says, I want to have a world-class university. Wherever I am, this is what I want to do. So the national system is seen in the context of this overall phenomenon of greater competitiveness, global competitiveness, and the importance of universities and research at the moment, I think, in this context, as far as the rankings are concerned. And we see universities taking very seriously, thinking about how they're going to address the rankings. But of course, this depends on each and every university and its own specific strategy. And same for you, where do you want to be in 5 or 10 years? Which are the indicators you would like to have of your performance and how you have achieved this? And of course, there are many different rankings, differences in the rankings, and I think many universities are looking, given my particular position, how can I demonstrate as a university where I would like to be, and what are the strengths, the particular strengths of my university. There is some evidence as well that students, but especially international students, do indeed use the international rankings to inform their choices, especially QS, as Stephen said, times higher, but especially the QS rankings have provided all sorts of additional analyses to help students, their parents, make decisions on which are the best universities from very different perspectives. Rankings also are used often by higher education institutions to identify partners. If I see a university that's roughly in a different country, in a different continent, roughly at the same place, then maybe that's a university that I would like to collaborate with at the same time as to continue to work with my partners in other places. The effects, the restructuring of systems. I will talk a little bit more about this from the perspective, the French perspective, but we see that also in Germany we've had an excellence initiative, and you have your own initiative here. This is very much linked to the impact of global rankings. Similarly, as we've said, for institutional profiles, it also impacts, and I think this really is, I think, for the future, a key issue. We focus on research for the last 10 years. We need to start focusing on the quality of teaching and not just looking at our place in research. At least that's, from our perspective in EUA, a very important point. Rankings have also pushed changes in research practice, the pressure to publish in English, for example, also the pressure to publish full stop, more and more, and I think here we've also seen policy impact related to changes in immigration regulations. Depending, if you're a student from a highly ranked university, you have a much better chance of being accepted in some systems. And also I think the general public, students, employers are also quite often looking at where a graduate comes from and what is the rank of the universities, at least in some countries. Just to finish, can we look at other ways of seeing rankings? Can we consider rankings actually as one part of a general trend towards more transparency, greater accountability, and a need to compare? And also what we see, at least in our discussions, and Russia is also a member of the Bologna process, when we look at quality and quality assurance, that one of the big questions on the agenda that universities are important for universities is we need to be more transparent and open and provide more information actually on what are we doing, what are our outcomes, where are our graduates going, and many other questions. So you can see the rankings in a way as something like that, and link it to the discussion on transparency and accountability. These are just a list which you might be interested in of the different ways in which in different countries we're looking at trying to improve transparency and accountability. And this is a development in parallel with the rankings. Finally, their significance. So just a couple of points to end with that we could perhaps discuss. So the rankings, they do claim to measure quality, but as I've just said, they do focus on a very limited set of attributes, of elements that tend to be comparable, and there are very few of them, and they're all tend to be linked to research and to publications in one way or another. And they assume that this measure is a measure of quality. As I can just give the most obvious example that perhaps is a bit ludicrous is in the Shanghai ranking you have the question of how many Nobel Prize winners do you have, and that is considered a measure of quality. Now it may well be, but it's perhaps not always the most relevant indicator. And then you do see universities who tend to want to employ on some basis or another former Nobel Prize winners just to increase their score in the rankings. And I'm not sure whether that really is very helpful for the development of the university. But at the same time, the rankings have made us all try to think about what we mean about good higher education. What is a university? What are our goals? What are our strategies? And each university is different, and I think the process of differentiation of institutional missions has been promoted, pushed by the discussions on rankings, even if it does mean as well that it's not just a situation that is relevant for Europe and for the United States, for example, but we have the enormous rise, as we all know, in Asia, of the university systems and the developments going on
when we
there.
designed the program,
And we also know that quality is no longer something that universities can decide on themselves, more or less, and just say we are a good university. There are the rankings, there is the quality assurance system, and a whole set of other indicators to be considered and demonstrated and proved ultimately towards society in the end. So I think that's my first set of remarks of the day, and I hope that you will have some questions, and thank you very much for listening.
My name is Dara Kazlo, I'm from Itmo University. So my first question is about Russian universities and rankings. Probably you know our national initiative about rankings and about five Russian universities among top 100 universities, and all these activities which follow. So my question is, what is European point of view? What do you think actually about our national program, about our new strategy in rankings, and how do you European universities consider our chances and our development? Probably you've seen it with the other countries like China or, I don't know, Korea, South Korea. Yeah.
I suppose my first remark was I don't know enough about Russia really to have an informed view on the system. But I think if I do know quite a bit about how many systems have changed, and it seems to me that when you have a very large and distributed system, as you have in Russia, that and you're looking to become more competitive, and Russia also has to function in the same global environment as everybody else, that it makes sense to have some kind of a differentiation between the institutions. And that's essentially, I think, what these different programs are. They're saying we need to have a large number of, or we need to have a small, in among the large number of overall universities, there needs to be a certain number of universities that are very research-intensive institutions and have the resources to be able to pursue their mission. And I think this is one of the challenges. All of us in the university system, I think, have been surprised at how quickly these changes have taken place. There was a long tradition in Europe, across Europe and also in Russia, that the universities were there, they were all the same, they're public bodies, they have a public mission to teach students and to carry out research. But the cost of research is spiralling. We have many global challenges to face. We need to work together, so we need to be more international, we need to have partners, and we need to conduct this research. Therefore, it seems clear, as in China or in Korea or in Germany or in France, the example that I'll talk about later, that this cannot mean that every university stays the same, that there needs to be a choice and a selection based on Russian priorities in your case. And I have listened to a presentation of some of those involved last year in the Shanghai International University Conference. Each part of the world is trying to think, how can we make the overall system evolve, and how can individual universities be encouraged to think about their own mission and their own objectives in this context. And I think we're all going through, nearly every country, at least the very large countries, are going through this process. We have, for example, in EUA, recently evaluated the whole of the Romanian system of higher education. Same thing, they have real problems of competitiveness and are trying, but it's more difficult there, to come up with a way in which they can somehow ensure that there is a core of good research being carried out in some top universities, and the other universities that are very important regional missions. You must surely have this in such a large country as Russia. Every region needs universities, higher education institutions in order to make sure that the local industry, the local population is well trained and well qualified. But it's maybe a different type of university mission than the one that you have, which is a very research intensive mission, or other universities. So I hope that answers your question.
Obecnie State University of Nizhny Novgorod, Yuri Sorokin. Mrs. Wilson, I have a biased question. Can you see slide number 3 or 4, the list of rankings?
If I can get this to
Maybe 3 or 4.
yeah,
Maybe second.
I'm just trying to get back.
There was
No,
no,
before.
no.
No, later.
3 or 4.
3 or 4? 4?
3.
3.
Yes.
This one.
There is a long list of rankings.
Yes. And if you're, now I can show my
Good
work.
thing.
They're all in here. They're all in these 2 publications. Every single methodological element.
There is an opinion that there are big 3. 1.
Shanghai?
Yes.
Yeah.
Then
QS?
yes. This and this.
Yvonne.
Somebody thinks so. Do you think that is so, or maybe they, you know that, as they say in Russia, "Мамы всякие нужны, мамы всякие важны." All mothers are necessary. All mothers are important.
As a mother, I have to say, yes, all mothers are important. I think there's, well, I have a personal view at least. I think the rankings that are commercially driven have their own interests. They want to make money, these people. So QS, with all its products, the Times Higher, less so. But these are run by newspapers. So they're in it to make their own profit. They're not necessarily, they want to sell you things, they want to sell you products. Shanghai Jiaotong is not a commercial concern. It's a university in China, in Shanghai, that actually has a research centre, a graduate research centre that looks at rankings. So my feeling is you get what you see from Shanghai, from the Shanghai ranking. It's only interesting for top research universities, but it's a different. And the same thing goes for some of the smaller ones, the Webometrics, the Taiwan and Leiden. These are universities that have created centres of expertise on ranking and do rankings with different types of criteria and metrics. And you need to look at each and every one of them to be able to understand what might be helpful for your own university. I think that's probably and you'll hear from Mikhail, my colleague now, that multi-rank is completely different. But the ones that make the money are clearly QS and PhD.
I'll say a few words about my own experience of having led a university in the United Kingdom. Our major concern in my university in the United Kingdom was that the university was not in the Global 100. I had worked in a university in the Global 100, Warwick, but the university at the time was not. And it was facing this critical situation, like many universities around the world. What about its reputation? It had excellent figures for employability, it had excellent learning and teaching quality, but its research was not strong enough to enter the Global 100. So what do you do? And I think what's going to start happening here is that there's going to be a proliferation of new kinds of ranking models which enable us to capture different qualities of different features of different universities. And I think this is part of the process of multi-rank, which is the beginning of that process. Our strategy in my university was to say, okay, we're not in the top global 100 for research. Where are we in the top 100? And the answer was, in our particular case, the Green League. The university I led was actually number 4 in the Green League. It was one of the top universities for environmental protection, environmentalism, environmental policy, and we advertised the university as being a top green university. Interestingly, that attracted a large number of students who were environmentally conscious and who felt this was very important. So I would foresee that we're going to see a fragmentation of the different kinds of rankings in order to represent the true qualities of universities, because I think there's a great danger facing our sector. The higher education sector is at risk from rankings because we are at risk of losing those major qualities which we know are important to our students and to our staff, because we want to appear in the top 100. For many that will not be possible. And so rankings will have to, as I think Mikhail will be saying shortly, have to start to reflect the true qualities of learning, of teaching, quality of the professors, which are the true character of a university. And when we reach that point, I think we're going to have a more sophisticated view of the ranking system. More questions, yes?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for a very interesting and wide presentation. It covered many different issues to rankings. I'm Katerina Tulugorova from ITMO University. And I wanted to ask your opinion on the following. Well, in my view, the ultimate goal of any university around the world would be the recruitment of high qualified students, because that's the starting point for the university growth in any direction. Therefore, my question is, in UK or in Europe, how do you see how many students, what's the percentage of students who actually look upon the rankings when they first apply to the university? I understand that for master students, that's probably higher. But the bachelor students who just appear there for the first time, would they really be looking at QS ranking or something like this? But we're searching for those high quality materials, so to say, to grow them to become part of the university. So what would you say, what's the ranking that addresses the student needs the most? In my eyes, that would not be QS because it's more academic oriented. Is there any ranking that's more student oriented? Or do students even look at those rankings in the first place when they for the first time apply? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I think it's not maybe the case in the UK, but in continental Europe, most bachelor students will come from the local area, so they're not going to really look at the rankings. And I think that's why it's very difficult. There's no real evidence. There's anecdotal evidence that international students, somebody coming from China who wants to come to Russia, or somebody from Korea who wants to go to Germany, they would want to know something about the different universities, and so they will look at the rankings. How we can attract the best students? Well, I think your local students are probably here. At least in Europe, they will probably have enough information on a range of universities in St. Petersburg, and they won't need the rankings at all. And I don't think there are rankings that can look at that. But as Mikhail is going to talk about now, the multi-rank, because there are so many different dimensions in the multi-rank, and it's not purely, or nearly almost all research-based as are the other rankings, then this is really, as Stephen has said, and you'll hear from Mikhail, I think that's, well, I would hope that in future this might be interesting for students as well. There are examples, there are national examples. I mean, we have the CHE in Germany, the rankings. So the Germans have a clear lists nationally of all their universities, and with all sorts of questions going from the ranking of the scientific disciplines to how many pubs and bars there are in the town. So it really covers a whole set of things that students might be interested in. And they do this nationally, but it didn't work when they tried to do it across borders. But this organisation that does that in Germany is part of the consortium that's dealing with the multi-rank, so it might be the opportunity to pass on to multi-rank, and then we can have a broader discussion about that.